Can one man's life be said to be worth more than another? It's a question impossible to ask, let alone answer. But as we follow the dusty tracks at Gallipoli from the Hellas Memorial to the cemetery at the farm, these are the things we consider. When we study the Great War, we of course study the battles and the tactics and the units and the technology, but it's much more than that, isn't it, really? It's the study of ordinary human beings, of ordinary people, of ordinary men and women in those extraordinary circumstances of the First World War. And when we visit the cemeteries and study the stories of those who never returned, and we see how their lives echoed not just across the battlefields themselves, but way beyond that, affected children and wives and sweethearts whose lives would never be the same again with the loss of someone on the battlefields of the First World War, we discover how important, I would guess, human life is and what it means to people, and how that the end of a life can be the end of so many more things beside, because with the death of someone in that great conflict was the end of a promise of greatness, a life unfulfilled. What could they have gone on to achieve? This is something I find myself over the last few years asking more and more when I visit the cemeteries, the vast cemeteries like Tyne Cot and the small ones like Hawthorne Ridge. What would these men, what would these women who died in the conflict, what would they have gone on to achieve? And could we say somehow that there might be some lives that were extinguished by that war that were more important than others, that their promise of greatness was more significant? It feels like a terrible thing to say, to even think, because each life is important, every life is important. But then when you study the lives of those who had already given so much in those final years of peace before the Great War, it does make you think. They'd achieved such a lot already by 1914. If they'd lived to see the world beyond the war, what more could they have given to the human story? What more could they have given to us all? And this is a question that we're going to ponder in this episode. But first, we begin on a dusty track on the edge of the sea, looking down into the blue waters of the Aegean, and we're standing with the mouth of the old Dardanelles visible below us, the famous waterway that took travellers through the narrows that split Asia and Europe into the Sea of Marmara and beyond to the Black Sea, a place not just of conflict in the Great War, but of ancient, classic conflict. This is in some respects where the classical old world met the new world of the 20th century. And it was here in 1915 that Britain, France and their respective empires went to war with Ottoman Turkey. We're in Gallipoli, and when we stand here on this track looking down to the edge of the cliffs, close to the very high point of Cape Helles, the sun often reflects in those blue waters. The ships still sail through these narrows. It feels almost timeless in some ways. And there is a great beauty here, a beauty in this landscape at Gallipoli, a beauty in its beaches, in its gullies, its ravines, and its high ground that overlooks those places where Australians and New Zealanders, British and Indian and French troops landed in April 1915. It is a beautiful landscape here at Gallipoli, but I'm always mindful that it is beauty tinged with sadness, with tragedy, with the tragedy of the 1915 campaign that ended in such terrible losses for both sides. And here at Cape Helles, the reminders of the Great War are not far away. As we walk up the track, ahead of us is the column of the Hellas Memorial to the Missing, and we walk up its steps into the bays of the memorial where the names of the missing of the Gallipoli Campaign are recorded. There were over 213,000 British and Empire, British and Commonwealth casualties at Gallipoli in 1915, half of them due to sickness, and over 28,000 died in the campaign, with more than 20,000 of them commemorated here. The original register of the Hellas Memorial records, "The Hellas Memorial is both the memorial to the Gallipoli Campaign and to the 20,763 men who fell in that campaign, whose graves are unknown or were lost or buried at sea in Gallipoli waters. Inscribed on it are the names of all the ships that took part in the campaign and the titles of the army formations and units which served on the peninsula, together with the names of 18,985 sailors, soldiers and marines from the United Kingdom, 248 soldiers from Australia, and 1,530 soldiers of the Indian Army." Now, when you think that 28,000 died and more than 20,000 are commemorated here, so that number have no known grave, that is a very high proportion, even for battlefields of the First World War. So how come so many, the majority of the dead at Gallipoli, do not have a known grave? When we look at contemporary photographs of the Gallipoli landscape and the battlefield as it was in 1915, we see a lot of isolated graves in trenches and in reserve positions and down in the gullies and on the beaches. We see battlefield burial sites and small regimental or battalion cemeteries, and we see larger cemeteries that were established during the campaign as well. But Gallipoli was a defeat for Britain and the Empire and for France. And in early January 1916, the last of those troops withdrew from the Gallipoli beaches, leaving their dead behind. When the Turks reoccupied the Gallipoli Peninsula, they went across it. They salvaged a huge amount of British war material. A lot had been left behind, some of it damaged, some of it destroyed, but a lot of it reusable. And they went across the cemeteries, and this is no disrespect to the Turks at that time, but they went through a lot of the cemeteries, and it's quite clear that some were destroyed, desecrated, that graves were dug up and bones were scattered all over the place. I read once that there was a belief amongst some ordinary Turks that the British buried their dead like warriors of old with treasure, and for ordinary Turkish people with so little money, the thought of digging up an enemy's dead and recovering treasure probably was an overwhelming one, so to a degree it's understandable. So it's clear that cemeteries and burial sites made during the 1915 campaign were eventually disturbed, if not lost. And by 1918, when the Ottoman Empire had been defeated in a wider war across its empire in places like Mesopotamia and Palestine, British troops returned to the Gallipoli Peninsula to recover the dead, to see what was left behind and try and establish proper burial grounds. Quite a few army chaplains returned at that time who had buried some of the dead because they could remember where they'd buried men from particular units or even particular individuals. And more than 30 cemeteries, permanent cemeteries, were established, but in most of them was a very high proportion of unidentified and unidentifiable soldiers, so they were buried as unknowns. Men at Gallipoli in 1915 did have identity discs or dog tags, but at this stage of the war every soldier only carried one, which was normally removed at the point of death, or if the body was laid out on the battlefield perhaps was unrecoverable. I've met people at Gallipoli who have found identity discs lying in the dirt in the places where the great battles there were fought. But what it meant was that the vast majority of those who had died in that campaign would have no known grave, and there would, like the battles on the Western Front and other theatres of war, there would be a need for a memorial to the missing here. Some of the Empire Commonwealth missing were commemorated on memorials close to where they actually fought, such as the Lone Pine Memorial commemorating the Australians on the high ground above Anzac, and the New Zealand Memorial at Chunuk Bair, for example. But the majority would find their names engraved in stone here on the Hellas Memorial. This was a memorial designed by Sir John Burnet, an Edwardian Scottish architect, one of the minor architects of the Imperial War Graves Commission, who was notable for the construction of public buildings in places like Glasgow and London, including work on Selfridges in London, for example. He worked not just on the Hellas Memorial, but also memorials in Palestine and at Suez. And the design of the Hellas Memorial is quite a conservative one in many ways, with a large obelisk surrounded by the panels of the names of the missing. There's no overtly Christian symbolism here. The Imperial War Graves Commission were mindful that they were building these memorials and indeed the cemeteries at Gallipoli in what was a Muslim country, and rightly that should be respected. But the Hellas Memorial does its job, and when you walk round the panels you can see the dominance of certain regiments within the Gallipoli Campaign. The Lancashire Fusiliers and the Manchester Regiment, for example. The Lancashire Fusiliers, with their 6 VCs before breakfast, as the saying goes, at W Beach on the first day of the landings in April 1915, are of course a famous regiment, but that was one of their regular battalions. But they had a number of territorial battalions, and that was true too of the Manchester Regiment, who are very heavily represented on the panels here as well. And those two units, with battalions as part of the 42nd East Lancashire Division, which was a Lancashire territorial division that had come across to Egypt in 1914, one of the first to be mobilised as an entire formation, and was sent on garrison duty to Egypt to relieve regular soldiers and guard parts of the Suez Canal, was sent to Gallipoli in 1915 and was involved in some of the most costliest battles around Krithia, for example, here at Cape Helles in that summer of 1915. And those losses are very, very visible when we look at the panels of the Lancashire Fusiliers and the Manchester Regiment. The contribution of the Royal Naval Division is also seen here. We see men from the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve from those battalions like Bembo, Collingwood, Hood, as well as soldiers of the Royal Marine Light Infantry who served alongside them and were detached and served with the Australians at Anzac, for example. We find the names of 5 recipients of the Victoria Cross, posthumous awards for the Gallipoli Campaign in 1915, 2 senior officers, brigadier generals, who died in the fighting, and name after name, story after story, which have often filled the books on this part of the Great War, and there are so many wonderful books on the Gallipoli Campaign, and I'll put a few examples of those onto the podcast website. When we walk round the memorial, which, like all memorials to the missing, is in order of precedence, so here it starts with the naval names and then moves on to the army, and we go through the corps of the army, like the artillery, and we come to the Royal Engineer panels. And at the beginning of the Royal Engineer panels are a list of the officers, and under the second lieutenants we find a name familiar to anyone interested in the Great War, Sassoon. Not Siegfried Sassoon, but Hamo Sassoon. Sassoon, H, Second Lieutenant Royal Engineers, who died of wounds at Gallipoli in 1915, the brother of Siegfried Sassoon, and to whom he dedicated one of his early volumes of war poetry. But it's not Sassoon that we've come to see. It's not a poet or a writer or a musician. It's another name, another life, another story. Just a few names up from Hamo Sassoon is another officer, another Royal Engineer officer who died at Gallipoli. Moseley, HGJ, Second Lieutenant. Harry Moseley, sapper, signaller, and more importantly, scientist. And it's his story that we'll focus on in this podcast. I'm guessing that Harry Moseley is not a name that most of you are familiar with. He wasn't decorated for bravery, he wasn't a senior officer, he didn't come from an influential family, he didn't leave behind diaries or letters that have been published. What he left behind was perhaps, arguably, an even greater legacy. So who was Harry Moseley? Henry Gwyn Jeffreys Moseley was born in Dorset in 1887 into a typical middle-class Victorian family. His father was a naturalist who died when Harry was quite young. He was educated at Eton, and science was his passion. This was a time as Britain emerged from the Victorian period into the Edwardian years, The developments in the understanding of science and what could be done with scientific knowledge was moving at a rapid pace, and young men like Harry Moseley wanted to play their part in that. So he followed his passion for science from Eton to Trinity College, Oxford, where he studied natural science, and then from 1910 to 1913 worked in the Manchester-based laboratories of a Nobel laureate, Ernest Rutherford. Those years with Rutherford gave him his ability to develop his ideas, to work on them, and then he moved to Oxford to carry on the research that he was doing until the war got in the way. In less than 2 years at Manchester and Oxford, his work had laid the foundations of X-ray spectroscopy, which had led to the development and the greater understanding of ideas about atoms, atoms being a particle of matter that uniquely defines a chemical element. Most importantly, his research had pointed to 4 missing elements in the periodic table, and that the numbering of the periodic table, which we may all remember from our distant science classes at school, was not a random thing, that it had basis in scientific understanding and indeed advancement. And for this work, which was in many ways at the very heart of modern science of that Edwardian period, he had been nominated for Nobel Prizes in both chemistry and physics. It was clear that Harry Moseley was going to play a major role in the development and understanding of science as it moved into a new age. Now, without this developing into a science podcast, the key things to remember when we look at Moseley's contribution to science is that to scientists, Harry Moseley is credited with establishing the concept of the atomic number. As such, his contribution to science just over those few years is immeasurable. And to bring it up to date, more than 100 years on, his work on X-ray spectroscopy has, for example, contributed to the work done on the surface of Mars to analyse what is there on the surface, in the soil and the rocks, all of it giving us understanding as to whether life on Mars is truly possible. And the ability to assess that goes back to the work that Moseley did before the Great War. If science is your thing and you want to discover more about the work that he did in greater depth, there's an excellent book about Moseley which I'll put a link to on the podcast website, which contains a number of scientific papers describing in detail the work that he did in those years before 1914. But of course the work that he was doing came to an abrupt end when the Great War broke out. In August 1914, Harry Moseley was actually in Australia at a science conference. He presented his paper and then got on the next ship going back to England, and on arrival he joined Kitchener's army, the new army that was then being formed across Britain. Lord Kitchener had made that call for 100,000 volunteers, and by the end of 1914 he had over 1 million, one of which was Harry Moseley. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Royal Engineers, and although there was no specific unit that could put his unique skills into some practical good on a battlefield, he was a very technical-minded young man and became a signals officer in a signals unit of the Royal Engineers. There was no royal signals in the Great War. Signalling was done at battalion level in infantry units with a battalion signal section, and then above that Royal Engineer units would have brigade signals and then divisional signals. And his signals unit was attached to the 38th Brigade, which was part of the 13th Western Division. This was a division of Kitchener's army formed from the Western Command area, so made up of units from the western side of Britain, including in his own brigade, King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment, for example, the South Lancashire Regiment, the East Lancashire Regiment, and there was another brigade within division that had a lot of battalions recruited from regiments from Wales. He trained with them at Bulford Camp and on Salisbury Plain, and then they moved to Woking, where his unit formally joined that 13th Western Division, and they began their preparations for overseas service. Now, this was a war in 1915 that was largely fought on the Western Front, and that's where most senior commanders thought the war would be won. But there were many who saw other opportunities in the wider world to fight this war, and Winston Churchill was one of those, and his idea for a second front would lead to the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915. So the men in this unit, and Harry Moseley with them, found themselves being sent on ships not to France, but to Egypt, to Alexandria, and then from there to Mudros, an island in the Aegean Sea, and from there to Suvla Bay in August of 1915. The original Gallipoli landings had ended in a stalemate similar to what had happened on the Western Front. British troops were dug in that ground on Cape Helles. Australians and New Zealanders had moved up off the beaches onto the high ground above what they called Anzac, Anzac being the nomiker for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, but the whole beachhead there was known as Anzac Beach or Anzac Cove, and they were now above it on the high ground, but they were facing the Turks with often only tens of yards between the trenches. And a second front was now to have its own second front with these landings at Suvla Bay, land further to the north in the bay at Suvla with the Suvla plain beyond it, and try and somehow outflank the Turks and bring the stalemate at Gallipoli to an end. The Suvla Bay landings, which perhaps deserve their own podcast, which I'm sure will come one day, don't really concern us in any great depth here, but from Harry Moseley's point of view, the units of the 13th Western Division began their landings at Suvla on the 6th of August 1915, and this, considering that they were a new army formation, a Kitchener's army formation, was actually the first entry into battle of new army recruits, of Kitchener's army men in the Great War. Most people think that that's the Somme. In fact, on the Western Front it was at Loos, but even prior to Loos, Kitchener's men were going into battle here at Suvla in August of 1915. So it was a significant turning point, not just in the Gallipoli Campaign, but the whole Great War, as volunteers were now being employed on the battlefield in great numbers. After landing at Suvla Bay, the units of the 38th Brigade, including the signallers that Harry Moseley were in charge of, made their way over to the right from the landing beaches up towards the high ground of Chunuk Bair. In some ways, and this was true of much of the Gallipoli Campaign, it was a bit of a confused advance. Maps were not brilliant at Gallipoli, and soldiers' geography of the ground over which they were meant to advance was often pretty poor. And as a signals officer at brigade level, Harry Moseley's job was to link up the communications between the infantry battalions in his brigade and brigade headquarters, and beyond that back to divisional headquarters. So as such, he would not be working in a specific location, probably moving quite frequently between the advanced elements of the brigade as they made their way up that high ground to the high point of Chunuk Bair and back on the beaches, because we're not, of course, talking about radio communications here. This is fixed communication, static telephone lines that will run often over great distances to relay posts, and then a new line was run off from that. And in addition, he would have set up signallers with lamps, with Lucas signalling lamps with a bright bulb in it, to morse back to relay posts to relay information back, and failing that, if battlefield conditions and indeed the bright sunshine prohibited the use of the lamps, then signallers would be there with flags signalling with semaphore back to whichever posts required the information, or whichever post forward of them needed information to continue with their advance. And I think this says a lot about the Great War, because here was a modern 20th century war with a lot of new weapons and equipment and technology. Moseley himself at the cutting edge of modern science, and here they were really using 19th century style communications. But that was the reality of battlefields at this point in 20th century conflict. In this confused advance up over the scrub and the slopes leading up to the high points above the beaches, part of Harry Moseley's job as the communications officer was to help them find their way in some respects by relaying information back as to what the best routes were, where the enemy was located. So this was vital in what became of that brigade's advance up from Suvla itself, vital in its success in getting to the high points which it reached. So on the 9th, 10th of August 1915, a few days after the landing, they were up on that high ground of Chunuk Bair, looking back down to Suvla behind them, the Turks still occupying the high positions above them, and the slopes beyond that. But of course the Turks were not just going to sit there and let the British land at Suvla. There was a reaction, a counter-attack to this. And on the 10th of August 1915, this huge wave of Turkish soldiers, in fact wave after wave after wave of them, struck the British and Empire positions both on the high ground around Chunuk Bair itself and on some of the lower precipices, in particular the area around what was known as the farm. And these new troops, for many of them the first time in battle, their positions eventually crumbled under these successive waves of Turkish attack. But the area around that ground known as the farm held, and it's likely that this is where Harry Moseley was killed. A signals officer, it was known that he was up in the forward zone of the battlefield, organising his signallers, probably linking up with the battalion level signals of the units that were up there, trying to make some sense of the disarray and confusion on the battlefield, and from that mission he never returned. He was officially listed as killed in action on the 10th of August 1915, aged just 27. And of course, so much had been achieved in that short life, those short years that he had working as a scientist before the war, ending here on the slopes of the ridges around a position known as the farm. But even though the fighting here was confused and the ground changed hands on a regular basis, and the fighting would continue to the end of the campaign, there doesn't appear to be any suggestion that his body was just left out on the battlefields and was not recovered. From some of the surviving letters, it's clear that someone found his body and removed some of his items from it and sent them back to the family. So at some point his body was recoverable. There's no details, though, of where it was buried. And while there's no details of his burial, there are some details of his death, recorded in the book that I mentioned previously, For Science, King and Country, The Life and Legacy of Henry Moseley. And again, as I mentioned, I'll put a link to that on the podcast website. In there we have two accounts of Harry Moseley's death, one from a Captain Crocker, who was his immediate commanding officer. I very much regret to inform you that Lieutenant Moseley, commanding one of my sections, was killed in action during the recent fighting. He was shot through the head and died instantly. I am glad to know that he was spared any suffering from wounds. He was a most promising officer, extraordinarily hard-working, and took an immense amount of interest in his work. I am very sorry indeed to lose him, and I beg to offer you my very sincere sympathy. This sorrow at his loss is felt by all the officers and men of my company, equally with myself. Now, on one level, when you read that letter, it reads like almost any other letter sent home by commanding officers when soldiers were killed on the battlefield. If you look at newspaper reports from any period of the First World War, you will see the same kind of letter being sent home to the families of the fallen. Shot through the heart, died at once, suffered no pain, killed instantly. And of course now when we read the memoirs of those who were there or listen to interviews with veterans, and I can recall myself talking to veterans in the 80s and 90s, the reality of death on the battlefield was very, very different indeed. So that letter, I think, perhaps does not tell the entire truth of what happened to Harry Moseley. Another letter that we have is from Captain Chadwick, who was the brigade machine gun officer and also Harry Moseley's friend, and he wrote to the family with the following: Harry died the death of a hero, sticking to his post to the last. He was shot clean through the head, and death must have been instantaneous. In him the brigade has lost a remarkably capable signalling officer and a good friend. To him the work always came first, and he never let the smallest detail concerning it go by him unnoticed. When he was shot, the Turks had got round our right flank, and were within 200 yards of us firing into our right. I was close to your son, and he was calmly telephoning a message to the division. This account, I think, sounds more believable. It's from a friend. He spared the family probably some of the more gruesome details of Harry's death, but it gives the situation a credible situation where a signals officer doing his duty being on the blower, talking to people down the line, explaining the situation on the battlefield. But of course, in the midst of an enemy counterattack, the assault by the Turks, he was incredibly vulnerable, sitting there with a fixed communication system, relaying information when the Turks were only 200 yards away, so it's probably not surprising that he was amongst the killed. So unlike many in the Gallipoli Campaign who were killed in attacks and their bodies lay out in no man's land and were unrecoverable, perhaps not recoverable at all until by the Turks when the campaign was over, this was not a case with Harry Moseley, that his family were left hanging, waiting for information, hoping beyond hope that he'd somehow survived. It was clear from the information from his brother officers that he'd been killed, so there was at least the ability to accept that. But what had happened to his body? We know today that his name is listed on the Hellas Memorial, but where might he have been buried during the fighting? And where might his remains be today? And that's the next question we'll ask as we head to the Gallipoli battlefields around the farm. Before we begin our journey down to the farm itself, we're beginning on the high ground at Chunuk Bair, above Suvla and above Anzac. And we're surrounded by a large number of memorials here. This is, when you come to visit Gallipoli, a very busy location. There are the symbolic Turkish cemeteries just down the road and the actual British and Commonwealth cemeteries. And close to where we're standing is the Chunuk Bair Cemetery and the Chunuk Bair New Zealand Memorial to the Missing, one of those localised memorials to the missing that we spoke of, in this case commemorating New Zealand soldiers who were killed in this area of the battlefield who have no known grave. There's also the large statue of Mustafa Kemal, who led his men in some of those wave after wave attacks on the British, New Zealand and Indian positions here. And it was in that action that he was struck in the chest by a bullet or a piece of shrapnel, and his life was saved by his pocket watch, which stopped the full force of it killing him. And I seem to remember that the watch is on display in one of the museums devoted to his life. Mustafa Kemal became the father of the new Turkish nation after the Great War, a national hero. And this is the reason why this site is often so busy, is that millions of Turks come here every year. We'll walk away from the area where the memorials are onto a track that begins to head down the slopes of the ridge. And the walk down to the farm and the farm cemetery that's here, one of the 30-plus Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries that are on the Gallipoli Peninsula, is quite a tricky one. When I used to bring ledger groups down here, I almost used to have to select who could come, because it was essentially taking what was nothing much more than a goat track down quite a steep slope through the trees to where the cemetery was located. And although there are bits of the track that are slightly better than that now, essentially it does take some effort, as do several of the cemeteries in the Gallipoli battlefield area. And I think that's something of their charm in some respects, is that many of them are in these isolated locations, and it feels like they are very much part of the landscape, and that the landscape gives you more by essentially having to make an effort to discover them, to find them, to visit them. When we take that track down to the farm cemetery, what do we find when we get there? A typical Gallipoli cemetery, different to the ones on the Western Front, surrounded by what you might describe as a rubble wall. Not just a pile of rubble, a more formal wall, but that's essentially what it is. It's a low wall rather than a high one, and it creates a bank around the cemetery. And you enter through a gate. There's a big area of open ground, and then there is not a cross of sacrifice, because of course this is a Muslim country, and as we mentioned previously, the Imperial War Graves Commission were keen to respect that. So instead of a separate cross, a visible cross, there is like a screen wall really at the back of the cemetery on which there is some Christian symbolism. So it kind of blends into the nature of the site more and is less obvious. And I think that is an important thing to do, to respect the religion of the country where these cemeteries are located. Now, the headstones in Gallipoli cemeteries are not like the headstones in France and Flanders. They're what's called Dutch stalls, so they're quite low down, angled slightly, and they have the details of the soldier, name, rank, number, units, date of death, personal inscription, and a religious symbol. There are no cap badges engraved on the headstones, and they're much smaller than the standard headstones that we see in the battlefield cemeteries and the concentration cemeteries of the Western Front. And when you visit the Gallipoli cemeteries, you can go into many down on the beaches at Anzac or on the landing beaches at Cape Helles, and you'll see row upon row of headstones. And you remember there's quite a lot of effort to come down to the farm. And when I used to bring people down here and we'd go in through the entrance to the cemetery and walk across the large area of grass lawn, most of them stopped and looked and said, "Oh, we've come all this way down that steep track and there's only 7 men buried here." Because what you see when you come in are just 7 headstones. Now that does not mean that just 7 men are buried here, because at Gallipoli a decision was made with these cemeteries to not mark the resting place of the unknown soldiers in the Gallipoli cemeteries. So unlike the Western Front, where you can walk along the rows of graves at Tyne Cot, for example, and see unknown soldiers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, from Britain, an unknown lieutenant of the Great War, you can't see any of that here because of the logistics of moving stone into these cemeteries. It was considered too much to mark the grave of every soldier. So the rows and the rows of the unknowns, who are properly buried in all of these cemeteries, like this one here at the farm, there's nothing marked showing where their rows of graves are except the map in the original register. So when some of the people that I would bring here were somewhat disappointed by the fact that there was only 7 graves here, in fact, there are 7 known British burials, 10 unknown British burials, 1 unknown New Zealand burial, and 634 whose unit is not known. So in fact, a cemetery that looks as if only a handful of men are buried in it contains the graves of more than 650 British and Commonwealth soldiers. What's the history of the farm cemetery? The farm was a stone shepherd's hut located on these western slopes of Chunuk Bair overlooking Suvla Bay, where Harry Moseley and those lads of the 13th Western Division made their landings in August of 1915. British troops advanced up here from the Suvla Bay landing area in that period of the 6th to the 10th of August 1915, and by the 8th of August the positions around the farm were held by a mix of units, including the 10th Gurkha Rifles, the 9th Battalion, the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and Maoris from the New Zealand Division. So we've got 3 different types of units there. Gurkhas, men part of the Indian Army, the 9th Royal Warwicks, a Kitchener's Battalion, a new Army battalion raised at the very beginning of the war in that wave of volunteers that stepped forward all over Britain to enlist, and the Maoris. Now, the Maoris served in the Maori Pioneer Battalion, the pioneer units of the New Zealand Division, and part of ANZAC, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. And they had come ashore as pioneers, not necessarily as fighting troops. But the distinction between fighting troops and pioneers very quickly became blurred, and the Maoris gave a very good account of themselves in the Gallipoli Campaign, and they would continue to serve as pioneer troops to the New Zealand Division for the rest of the war. In the final phase of the war, Maoris were commissioned into the Maori Pioneer Battalion, and I think that really expresses how attitudes had changed towards what the British would have considered native troops in that final period of the First World War. It was close to here that on the 10th of August that massive Turkish counterattack came in and pushed units right back from the slopes of the high ground and down back towards the beaches, but the ground here around the farm, as we've mentioned, held. There were heavy losses in that August fighting, some battalions almost annihilated, with high levels of men killed, wounded, and some taken prisoner. The cemetery as we see it today, with the more than 650 burials, was made in 1919. when the area around the farm and these slopes beneath Chunuk Bair were cleared of the dead. And in some cases this would have been the remains of soldiers that had been lying out on these battlefields since 1915. In other cases it was small burial grounds that had been disturbed post the evacuation of British and Commonwealth forces here, and in other cases it was cemeteries that had been found and were not properly marked and needed concentrating into a new site. Now the realities of all of this kind of work, even on the Western Front, meant that a very high proportion of men found during this type of grave concentration would understandably not be identified. No dog tags were found with them, not enough artefacts identifying who they were, and so they would be buried as unknown soldiers. In most cases it was only barely possible to establish as to whether they were British or Turkish. The only ones here who could be identified were 7 men from the 9th Battalion of the Worcestershire Regiment, another new army, Kitchener's Army Battalion, part of that 13th Western Division. Amongst them is their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Munn, who was killed on the 10th of August 1915, aged 50, and he's here with 2 of his majors, Major Boyd Moss, DSO, and Major Crofton, and between the 3 of them they'd served in many Victorian campaigns. Munn with the Nile Expedition of 1897 and in the Boer War with the Imperial Yeomanry. Boyd Moss had served in the Boer War, where he'd been awarded the DSO and been mentioned in dispatches, and Crofton had served with the North Staffordshire Regiment originally in 1885 in the Sudan. And so what we see here are typical officers in a new army battalion, often referred to by the men as dugouts, i.e. they were dug out of retirement having served in these Victorian campaigns, but of course brought with them a lot of military experience and combat experience in some of these smaller wars. Whether that prepared them for the Great War is another thing, but it must, I think, at Gallipoli have felt familiar kind of ground to be fighting over, considering the places in which they fought as young officers. So just 7 men out of the 650 here identified, and what we know of the 9th Worcesters that are buried here is that they lost 8 officers and 112 men in this fighting, and their regimental history gives the following account of what happened here. At dawn on the 10th of August, the enemy on the crest line above the position of the 9th Worcesters opened fire and commenced a bombing attack. Great bombs were rolled down to burst in our lines. Then the enemy came over the crest of the ridge in wave after wave of densely packed troops, firing as rapidly as possible. The 9th Worcesters held their ground, meeting and repulsing the enemy's rushes. For some 3 hours a desperate struggle raged. By 7 a.m. Colonel Nunn had been killed. Captain Rolfe, mortally wounded, fired his revolver up the slopes as he lay there. At last, when nearly all the officers and most of the men were down, the remnant of the 39th Brigade fell back to the more sheltered positions in the dead ground at the head of the ravine. So these men of the Worcesters, whose graves are marked here, these are the known soldiers. What of the unknowns that are buried here? Well, considering the nature of the fighting in that description from the history of the 9th Worcesters, amongst them were not just the infantry but the supporting engineers, the signallers, and of course amongst them was Harry Moseley. And given that this is essentially a localised cemetery, it's not a cemetery where graves are brought in from the whole of the Gallipoli battlefields, it's from the immediate area, from the beachhead down at Suvla up to the high ground of Chunuk Bair, probably mostly from the slopes of this ridge on which it sits. It's not unreasonable to think that, given as well that probably most of the unknowns in here are men from his division, the 13th Western Division, it doesn't seem unlikely that Moseley is among them. Now, we can't use his kind of scientific rigour to prove this, but for all those who visit here and some who are disappointed seeing only 7 marked graves, not realising that there is row and row of unknown soldier in here, among those rows it doesn't seem incredulous that one of the world's greatest unknown scientists is buried there with them. Could the farm be the last resting place of Harry Moseley? And this certainly is the place that I come to when I visit Gallipoli and want to remember Harry Moseley. Which draws us back, I suppose, to our original question. Can one life be worth more than another? I think one of the things that I've learned through studying the Great War is that there is a myriad of faces when it comes to the men and women who died in that conflict, from so many backgrounds, from so many nations, from so many religions, with so many stories. And Harry Moseley's, of course, is one of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives just on the British and Commonwealth side who perished in that great war. But we have to look at what the scientific community thought of him, and Isaac Asimov later wrote, "In view of what he might have accomplished, his death might well have been the most costly single death of the war to mankind generally." Now that's not something that you could say about every soldier, but who knows what promise of greatness lies in so many cemeteries, from Gallipoli to Palestine to Salonika to Mesopotamia and the Western Front. Might amongst those serried ranks be someone who would have found a cure for cancer? Who knows? We could endlessly speculate upon this, but we know with Harry Moseley that he gave so much in his short life. He contributed so much to the collective knowledge of mankind, and something that resonates still even more than a century later, as man now looks to expand beyond his own planet, beyond his own world, to new worlds, and on to Mars. And part of Harry Moseley will travel there too, in the way that information and scientific knowledge is gathered. War kills and destroys. We know this from our study of the Great War. It robs men and women of their futures. It robs mankind of what their true achievements may have been. Whether one is more important than another is impossible to say. But here at the farm, these are the kind of questions that we have to ask about men like Harry Moseley, as we search for answers, for truth, for understanding along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.